Hello, it's Shari here today, and I am going to be making this shaker card with the new manatee set from lawnfawn. So for my manatees, I am going to be white embossing them with heat embossing on some narwhal cardstock here. So this card doesn't have any coloring on it really. I am going to use a little bit of colored pencil on these just to give them some rosy cheeks, but other than that, there is no coloring on this card at all. So I have a little piece of some narwhal cardstock, and I am just using my powder tool to get rid of any static that's on that piece so that my embossing powder only sticks to my ink. I'm using Versamark ink, which is a clear sticky ink, really good for embossing, and I've actually just put both of my little manatees together on one block, so I only have to stamp them once. And I'm going to be using the dies to cut these out, so it really doesn't matter where I stamp them on this piece of cardstock. Now that I have my manatee stamped out in that clear ink, you can see the impression there. I'm going to use my white embossing powder, also from lawnfawn. I've just got it in this little container here with a little spoon to make it easier to pour out and apply. And I'm just going to put that right on there, and you can see that is sticking everywhere I inked and not sticking to where I used the powder. And the other stuff I can just kind of wipe away with my thumb. Like I said, we're cutting these out, so it really doesn't matter if there's some stray embossing outside of the manatees. I'm using my heat tool here to heat them up and melt all that embossing powder. And then once that's all melted and cooled a little bit, I like to let it cool just a little bit before I use the tape to hold the dies in place on these little manatees. So look how cute they are cut out of that narwhal cardstock. And we didn't have to color them at all. I've got some pieces of Watercolor Wishes paper in different colors here that I've picked out, and I've decided where I want all these pieces to go. I'm going to use the porthole frames that you saw there, and I'm going to be layering them over this blue. I'm going to cut a blue circle using that largest outside in circle die. So I've cut the blue circle, and that'll sort of be my background for my little scene inside of this frame here. And then I am going to use some Storm Cloud cardstock, which is the darker gray cardstock, and I'm going to cut the porthole frames from that. And I actually cut all of them because I haven't cut my dies apart yet, so I have some of the smaller ones to use on a future project, just with one pass through my die cut machine. So you can see here how this is going to shape up a little bit. They're just going to kind of float in my blue circle here. But on the bottom, I wanted to put some waves. So I'm using the new Stitch Wave border dies. And I've got both the dark and the light of the aqua color that comes in the Watercolor Wishes collection. So I'm just cutting the edge of these, and I know they're wider than they need to be, but I'm just figuring out kind of where I want them to fall. Now that wave in the middle there is going to go sort of underneath my porthole frame, so the porthole frame is going to be in front of my waves. But I put the darker piece in the back, I'm going to layer the lighter one over top, and then I'm going to have a dark one on top of that. And I used all three of the waves that come in that set. So you can see there how those are going to layer together. And once I figure out where I want them on that back, I will just trim off the extra on the sides. So I'm going to go ahead and trim these down. I just traced with my pencil where those needed to be trimmed. And then I can just glue those together. I'm just going to use some dry adhesive with a tape runner and layer those one on top of each other the whole length of that 6x6 piece of paper. So I'm going to go ahead and put my background on my card base. So this was cut from a 12x12 sheet. So you can see the darker pink is on the back where I'm putting all the adhesive. And I'm just making sure I got a whole lot on there. And I am just going to layer that on the background here. And this is cut with the largest of the dotted rectangle stackables. Now I can go ahead and put my waves down on the bottom. And kind of figure out where I want that wave at the top to fall. it's easier to do this and make it wider and then just trim off the edges like I'm doing here versus trying to figure out exactly what you want to see on your piece. I seem to always end up with like an odd piece on the edge when I do it that way. So I have the largest of the slide on over circle dies here, and I'm going to cut a whole bunch of pieces with this and stack them up to make the thickness where my shaker is going to go. I could have easily done this by cutting that largest porthole frame all these times from this pink cardstock and stack them as well and just offset the holes. I'm not quite sure why my brain didn't figure that out at the time, but in hindsight, that was what I would do if I was remaking this card, because the slide on over circles are not quite exactly the same size, so the pink is going to peek out just ever so slightly from behind that storm cloud circle. But you know what? I'm actually okay with that. I kind of like getting to see the pink. It lets you see the color that's behind it. Otherwise, I would have cut all of this out of the same storm cloud cardstock so it all looked the same, but I wanted that pink edge to it. So I'm just going to let that dry. I stacked all those, glued them down using my glue tube, and I put my block on it just to kind of hold them all in place while it dries. Now I have a piece of clear acetate here, and I'm going to use that same outside in circle that I used for the blue circle, and I'm actually going to slide it between two pieces, or a folded piece rather, of typing paper when I run it through my die cut machine. And the reason why I did that is because my cutting plates are really cut up, and I feel like when I run something like clear acetate through, all those little pieces of paper stick to it like crazy. So just to keep it clean, I used the typing paper and ran that through. Now I'm going to layer this porthole frame on top of the clear, and I'm using a very thin adhesive runner here. And the reason why I'm doing this instead of the glue tube is because I want it to stick to that acetate immediately. I don't want to have to wait for it to dry. I don't want it to be sliding around. So that's why I decided on this form of glue when using the acetate. So I use the glue tube for all those pink circles, but I'm going to use this small thin tape runner for the acetate pieces. And because I have the little holes in the porthole frames, I am having to stop it at each little hole. I don't want my adhesive showing behind those holes. So I'm not going to glue it together just yet because I want to be able to fill my shaker with all the stuff inside. So I'm going to go ahead and put the blue circle on the background here. And that circle will be layered over the top of the waves. And I did that on purpose. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but that's the look I wanted to go for, that it was kind of in front of it. So I also am going to stamp out some of the little seaweed that comes in this set on some scraps of green Watercolor Wishes paper, and I'm going to be doing two different versions here. So this one I'm using the Versamark ink and the white embossing powder just like I did on the manatees, and I'll white emboss those. And partly why I'm doing this two different ways is so that there's some variety in my little seaweed pieces. And then the other little strip I have here, I'm going to stamp the same image but using the cilantro ink. So kind of a tone-on-tone green ink on a green background. And now that I have all of these stamped out and also heat embossed, I'm going to use the die and just cut them all out so I have a whole bunch of seaweed to work into my card design. I've also cut a piece of the yellow Watercolor Wishes paper with one of the fancy folded banners, the arched curve one. And this is where I'm going to put my sentiment. So here's a little trick when you have a curved thing like this and you need to curve your sentiment. I'm going to lay my block on top of it And I'm just using my grid mat to kind of center it up. But I'm going to lay my block on top of it. I'm going to stick it down correctly, so face down, exactly as you would see those words, and then I'm going to go ahead and pick it up with another block. So instead of trying to curve it backwards, you curve it correctly and then you pick it up with another block. And I'm using some VersaFine ink to get a really nice crisp impression on this sentiment here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and fold those ends in, and that's going to layer over top of my frame when I get it all assembled here. So I'm going to go ahead and put down this pink stacked frame that I created. And I'm using the liquid glue on this one because we're doing paper to paper. It's going to work perfectly. And then also, it's going to give me a little wiggle room because it doesn't dry. You know, it's not dry, so it needs to dry. It's not going to be stuck immediately, and I can kind of tuck these little pieces of seaweed under my frame. So I'm going to just put these sort of along the bottom of the circle. I'm going to vary them. I'm going to put a green one beside an embossed one. But you can see how doing the embossing and the stamping gives you a little variety, even though you're using the same image over and over again. I'm also using my tweezers so I can see what I'm doing and I don't smear my glue everywhere. It helps keep my card nice and clean. So here's the only coloring I did on the card. I used a pink colored pencil to add some little rosy cheeks to my manatees. And then I added some purple colored pencil to the girl's eyes, sort of like eyeshadow, just for a little bit of color and variation in the images. But other than that, I had no coloring on this card. I'm also going around inside my circle with my powder tool to kind of make any adhesive that might be in there not sticky anymore. And now I'm going to add my little shaker elements. So I have these little shells that I just got from Little Things from Lucy's cards. There's blue shells, there's yellow shells, and there's some pink tiny shells. And they have a nice cool iridescent sheen to them. I'm also adding in some seed beads that I have. One has a little bit of an aqua tint, the other are clear, and I feel like these look like bubbles. I always like these in ocean themed cards. I also added just a few of the pink ones just to kind of bring in that pink of the frame a little bit. I also used my anti-static tool on the back of the acetate just to try and take some of the static away, but as you can see, those little shells sort of jumped up to that acetate. I always seem to have problems with static, but this one actually wasn't so bad. A lot of times I have problems with the stuff inside sticking to my glue, but these actually moved around pretty great, so I was happy with that. I'm using some tape runner for my banner here, again, because I'm sticking it on the acetate, but I am going to use some liquid glue just to sort of hold down those edge pieces on the end. And I'll set a block on that while it dries just to hold those pieces flat. For my manatees, I am going to use glue dots again because I'm sticking them onto the acetate. You could use a glue runner, whichever you have. I just feel like with odd shaped things like this, the dots work really well. And then to finish off, I'm going to add a couple elements around my little shaker scene I've created here. I'm using a few more of those little seaweeds that I made earlier with the embossing and the stamping and tucking those under that wave that's in the front there. I just feel like that adds a little bit more to the bottom of the card. And then finally I used some clear sequins in a couple different sizes. These are again from Little Things by Lucy's cards, and I'm adding them to the top. I think that they look like bubbles up there kind of floating up from the manatees, especially since they're clear. So I think that has a nice finished look and gives a little more shine to the outside of the card, not just the sequins inside. So there is the finished card with those shells and the beads that look like bubbles floating around inside. I think that's really cute. So here's another look at that card. Thanks for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.